parents destroy my house because I didn't invite them to my son's birthday party due to their hatred for my brother's wife, but now I'm destroying their retirement dreams with a lawsuit. I understand that some of you might think I'm the bad one for what I did, and maybe you think it was too extreme. But after everything my parents have done, I feel they deserved it, especially for how they've treated my brother and what happened at my son's birthday party. But before getting into all that, I need to provide some context so you can understand why I've reached this point. I'm 32 years old, married, and have a son who just turned 2. My brother is 28, and my parents are 59 and 57. I would never say my parents were monsters or anything like that. They weren't extremely abusive or anything, but they were always controlling, especially with the major decisions my brother and I had to make. A simple example is how, when we were kids, they chose the extracurricular activities they wanted us to do. While my brother and I had some interests of our own, it was never entirely our choice. If we wanted to play sports or join a debate club, our parents always intervened. They wanted to decide what was best for us, even if it often didn't align with what we really liked. It wasn't like they forced us to do terrible things, but there was this constant subtle control over our lives. This became more evident when it came time to choose a career. I had always wanted to study graphic design. I loved drawing and working with design software since I was a teenager. But my parents disagreed. According to them, that wasn't a serious career and wouldn't take me anywhere. They wanted me to study business administration, or something more respectable. We sat down to discuss it a million times. They always brought up the same point. Think about your future. Graphic design isn't stable. In the end, I followed my instincts and chose graphic design. Well, needless to say, my parents weren't happy with that decision. For years, at every family gathering or event, they brought up my so-called bad career choice. Things like, well, she's the artist of the family, so she doesn't worry about serious things. Or, you still have time to choose something more stable. They reminded me again and again. It was frustrating, but at least I knew I was doing what I loved. And when I landed a good job at a digital marketing firm and started earning more money than I ever imagined, they finally shut up. Not that they apologized or anything, but at least they stopped making those comments because, well, apparently money made everything seem more respectable in their eyes. With my brother, it was a bit different. He always had an interest in 2 fields, engineering and economics. Of course, my parents loved the idea of him studying economics. I still remember the discussions at the dinner table. My brother said he was seriously considering going into engineering, but my parents insisted that economics was a better option. Eventually, he chose what they wanted, although I know engineering was always something he was more passionate about. I don't think he's bitter or anything because, after all, he was interested in economics too. But I've always thought that if he hadn't been under that pressure, he would have chosen engineering. Now, the real problem started about 5 years ago, when my brother began dating a girl named Ashley. I'll call her that to protect her privacy. It's not her real name. When he introduced us to Ashley, there was absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was kind, smart, and clearly loved my brother. However, from the beginning, my parents disagreed. There wasn't any clear reason for this. They just didn't like the idea of my brother being in a serious relationship with her. I suspect it was because they wanted to maintain some level of control over my brother's life, even in his personal relationships. For quite some time, they tried to influence him to stop seeing her, but since they couldn't, they eventually started tolerating her. Not because they genuinely liked her, but because they realized my brother wasn't going to break up with her. Things eased a bit when they saw that Ashley was studying the same field as my brother. That seemed good enough for them, as if somehow that validated the relationship. But everything changed a couple of years ago when my brother started talking about marrying Ashley. By that point, they had been together for 3 years and were very serious. As expected, when my brother told our parents he was thinking of proposing, they weren't thrilled. It wasn't that they were completely opposed, but they weren't convinced either. They started saying maybe it was too soon, that he should wait a little longer, make sure it was the right decision. It was clear they didn't want him to marry Ashley. I remember my mom saying something like, "It's a lifetime decision. You can't just take it lightly," as if my brother hadn't been thinking about it for years. So, one weekend, my brother and Ashley eloped to Las Vegas and got married in secret. They didn't tell anyone, not even me, which I admit hurt a little. I would have loved to see my brother get married, but I also understand why they did it that way. With our parents in the picture, it never would have been a peaceful wedding. I found out afterward when they told me, and even though it hurt not to be there, I fully supported them. I knew it was the only way my brother could have the wedding he wanted without our parents' drama. Since then, things with our parents have gone downhill. It's been almost 2 years since they got married, and my parents still haven't forgiven my brother. They invite him to family events, but they always tell him not to bring Ashley. They don't recognize her as his wife and refer to her disrespectfully, calling her things like "your companion" or "that girl." when talking about her. It's humiliating. My brother has stopped attending family events because of this. I completely understand why. The only times we've seen them together in the past 2 years have been at events hosted by other relatives, and every time that's happened, my brother and Ashley leave early because they can't stand my parents' comments. Now, all of this was already bad, but what really pushed me to this point was my son's birthday. We had organized a small backyard party to celebrate, and of course I invited my parents, my brother, and Ashley. But when my parents found out Ashley was invited, they started making demands. They told me that if I didn't uninvite her, they wouldn't come. Their reason was that they couldn't bear to be in the same place as her because that woman has no respect for the family, and they'd never be able to accept her after what she did, marrying my brother without their blessing. I simply told them that if they didn't want to come, they didn't have to. Sarcastically, I added something like, "Well, no one's going to miss you, so do whatever you want." I wasn't going to uninvite Ashley. She's my brother's wife, and besides, I like her. There's no reason she shouldn't be at my son's birthday party. If my parents wanted to make a drama out of this, that was their problem, not mine, so they were uninvited. In the end, I didn't expect them to show up, but to my surprise, they did, uninvited. They arrived with a gift and all, though it was obvious they weren't happy. We placed the gift on the table with the others, and I welcomed them. However, as soon as they arrived, they started doing what they do best, opening their mouths to say something unpleasant. They started muttering about Ashley, hinting that they shouldn't have come because no one respected their wishes. I confronted them immediately and told them that if they planned to ruin their grandson's birthday, they should leave right away. My mother responded that they couldn't leave because they had brought a gift. I told them they could take it back if they wanted, I didn't care. After that, they stayed silent but moved to a corner, glaring at everyone. Almost an hour later, I went to the kitchen to check on some snacks I had put in the oven for the guests. What I saw left me frozen. The kitchen was filled with smoke, and the food was completely burnt. The first thing I did was turn off the oven and take out the charred snacks. But what really puzzled me was that the oven was set to its maximum temperature. I had never set it that high, and not enough time had passed for the food to burn that badly. And the strangest thing was that my parents were no longer there. They had left, and their gift had disappeared too. It wasn't just the snacks. The walls were covered in smoke, and other things in the kitchen were also ruined. We need to repaint because we've tried cleaning, and those stains won't come off. At least the party wasn't completely ruined, as my husband went out to get more snacks, and everything continued as if nothing had happened, but it could have been much worse. At that moment, part of me thought maybe it was my mistake, that I had gotten distracted. But another part of me started to suspect. Could my parents have done this? After all, they knew I was busy with the guests. If they went into the kitchen and turned up the oven to sabotage the food, it would have been easy. But I had no proof, at least not until I decided to call them. I recorded the conversation to have proof in case I decided to sue them. I casually asked if they had turned up the oven temperature as a joke. At first, I didn't mention the damage, hoping they wouldn't panic if they knew what really happened and wouldn't confess. Then my father, in his typical tone, responded, "Well, burning those snacks was what you deserved for not respecting the family's wishes." At that moment, my blood was boiling. I told them their little joke had caused a disaster in my kitchen. There was so much smoke that the walls, curtains, and several objects were stained. We had been close to starting a fire. I told them I was ready to take this to the police because what they did wasn't just a joke. It caused property damage. I was prepared to sue them, and I warned them that if they didn't want to ruin their future, they better be ready to face the consequences. My parents got defensive, but they were clearly scared. They're about to retire, and a lawsuit or a problem with the police could ruin their plans. They still have a few more years of work ahead, and being fired now would be the worst thing that could happen to them. But honestly, I don't care anymore. I'm determined to see this through. I think they've crossed a line they can't come back from, and I won't let them keep interfering in our lives. So here I am, wondering if I'm the bad one for wanting to ruin their future. I'm almost sure I'm going to report them anyway, but I want to know. Would I be the bad one if I reported my parents to the police, and that left them unable to retire? Update 1. I'm really surprised by the amount of support I've received. Honestly, I thought a lot of people would say I was being too harsh, or that I had taken things too far, especially after reading other stories on this subreddit, where even the most complicated situations seem to have more conciliatory endings. In my case, I expected at least some people to tell me that I should try to resolve things differently, talk to my parents again, or maybe that I shouldn't have taken such drastic measures. However, the vast majority of you believe I did the right thing by reporting my parents and holding them accountable for what they did. On one hand, it was a relief to read your responses. Sometimes when you're so deeply involved in a situation you can't see things clearly. Because yes, they are my parents, and even though what they did was unacceptable, a part of me still doubted whether it was right to take things this far. So, truly thank you for helping me see that I'm not crazy for wanting justice in this case. As I said I would, I reported the incident to the police. In the end, I don't think my parents will suffer too much because of it. It's not like they intentionally tried to burn my house down, but what they did was serious enough that they need to face legal consequences. For me, it's mainly a way for them to face the reality of their actions and realize that they can't just keep doing whatever they want without thinking about the repercussions. When I went to the police station to file the report, the officer asked me some very detailed questions about what had happened. I explained that, although the damage wasn't intentional in the sense that my parents didn't expect to burn my kitchen, it was the direct result of their recklessness. I told them about the recorded conversation with my father, where he practically admits to turning up the oven temperature on purpose as a sort of joke. That was enough for them to open an investigation, though the officer also warned me that the case might not go very far legally. Still, I felt I had done the right thing. On the other hand, I've also decided to sue my parents for the damage they caused to my home. What they did was completely reckless, and even though they didn't intend to cause so much trouble, it was a direct consequence of their irresponsibility. My lawyer explained that, although the act was technically an accident, in the sense that they didn't intend to cause so much damage, it's still considered negligent. He thinks we have a strong case, especially because my father basically admitted he did it as a joke. Even though my parents didn't expect this to escalate, the fact is that it did. When my parents were served with the police citation following the report, things blew up. I received a barrage of calls. Both of them called me repeatedly, one call after another. I could see the calls coming in nonstop, but I only answered my mom's call. It's always been easier to talk to her than to my dad, who is much more temperamental and harder to reason with. However, this time not even my mom was calm. As soon as I answered, she started yelling at me. She was furious and demanded to know why I had done this. She complained that the police had cited them, and that this could have serious consequences for them. She said that if they were found guilty, they could lose their jobs, which would be devastating for them. She reminded me that they don't have much time left before they retire, and that they still need to save more money for a comfortable retirement. My mom insisted that they never intended to cause so much damage, that it was just a small prank because they thought I was being unreasonable for not uninviting Ashley. According to her, all they wanted was to make me realize I wasn't respecting their wishes by inviting my brother's wife, whom they still refused to accept. But frankly, that sounds like a pathetic excuse to me. Even if their prank hadn't gotten out of control, what they did was still meant to ruin my son's birthday by ruining the snacks. Who in their right mind thinks it's reasonable to ruin their grandson's birthday just because they didn't get their way? I told her that, even though they might not have intended to cause so much damage, the fact is that they did. And not only was I not going to withdraw the report, but I was also going to sue them for the damages they caused to my home. I told her what they did was reckless and irresponsible, and I wasn't going to let it slide just because they are my parents. At this point, I had been dealing with their controlling behavior for too long, and this was the straw that broke the camel's back. To try and avoid a lawsuit, I offered her a solution. I told her that if they were willing to pay me $5,000, I would drop the report and not proceed with the lawsuit. That way, they could avoid the legal mess and simply take responsibility for their actions without having to go through a court process. I thought it was a fair offer. Plus, they wouldn't have to spend money on lawyers or drag out this conflict any longer. However, my mom immediately reacted, saying that was impossible. She said $5,000 was too much money, and they couldn't afford it right now. She insisted they weren't in a position to hand over that much money, especially with their retirement plans so close. But from my perspective, I wasn't asking for an unreasonable amount, considering all the repairs that had to be done in my kitchen. Between the curtains, the smoke-stained walls, and other expenses, it wasn't an outrageous sum. After she rejected my offer, I didn't have much more to say to her. I told her that if they weren't willing to pay me that amount, then there was nothing more I could do for them. I would continue with the report and the lawsuit, and they would face the consequences of their actions. That was the moment my mom realized there was no turning back. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I haven't received any more calls from her or my dad since then. I've talked it over with my brother and Ashley, and they think it's for the best right now. They are also fed up with our parents' delusions and believe that following through with this will teach them a lesson. Update 2. This time, I'm not here to talk about my parents or the lawsuit. In fact, although the situation remains the same and the report is still ongoing, I want to share something much more exciting. My brother and Ashley are going to have a baby. A few weeks ago, my brother called me, and I immediately knew he had something important to say. I'm going to be an aunt. The news of becoming an aunt filled me with so much joy. But it also made me think about how our parents will react when they find out. Obviously, my brother has no interest in telling them, and frankly, I'm not eager to break the news either. But I can already imagine what they'll think once they find out. I can't help but picture my mom, sitting on the couch, sipping her coffee with a permanent expression of indignation, saying something like, "A grandchild from that woman. I bet that baby will be born with its own ideas, just like its mother, and won't respect our traditions." My father, on the other hand, is probably going to complain about how the family name will be lost because that woman will raise the baby her way. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I really think that's the kind of thing going through my parents' minds. And to be completely honest, I'm not sure how they'll feel when they finally know. On one hand, it's their grandchild, and despite everything, they've shown affection for my son. But I also worry they might try to interfere in some way, even after all the drama we've lived through in the past few years. As for the lawsuit, things are still moving along. The police report is active, and we've also sued them for $15,000. We don't expect to get that full amount, obviously, but we believe we can reach a settlement before the case progresses further. My lawyer says we'll likely end up somewhere near $5,000, which would cover the kitchen repairs and allow us to close this chapter without further complications. So, while the situation with my parents is still complicated, I'm focusing on the positive. My brother and Ashley are going to be parents, and I'm confident they'll be incredible parents. We've already talked about future plans, and I'm so excited for our kids to grow up together. Update 3. It's been several months since my last post, or maybe more, and I have to say they've been exhausting in every possible way. Between the police report, the lawyers, and all the complications that came with that, I feel drained. For those of you who've never had to go through something like this, I honestly don't recommend suing unless it's absolutely necessary. It's a slow, stressful process, full of moments where you feel like there's no end in sight. In my case, even though the outcome was relatively positive, I can't say I've come out of this emotionally unscathed. At least the important thing is that it's all behind us now, and we can start closing this chapter. As for the police report, some of you were probably expecting something more dramatic, like my parents ending up in jail or facing more severe consequences. I'm sorry to disappoint those of you with that expectation, but my parents didn't end up in prison. As I mentioned before, although what they did was reckless, it wasn't something they did with the intent of deliberately burning down my house. It was a joke, in quotes, that went terribly wrong, and thankfully for everyone, it didn't end in something worse. To me, it's clear it wasn't just a simple joke, but I'm not the one who makes or enforces laws. What really terrifies me when I look back is thinking about what could have happened if the situation had been more serious. There were kids, including my son, and adults in the house when all this happened, and we could easily be talking about a tragedy. Luckily, we only had to deal with the destruction in the kitchen, which, while expensive and annoying, didn't actually put anyone in serious danger. My parents, on their end, should consider themselves lucky that this didn't end with them facing more serious charges, because something much worse could have happened. In the end, the justice system decided my parents didn't deserve jail time, but they did receive a $1,000 fine. It's not much, but at least it's something. It's a symbolic way of recognizing that what they did was wrong, and that there should be consequences for their actions. Honestly, I would have liked to see a slightly harsher punishment just to drive home the seriousness of the situation, but at least there's some justice. So, while it's not the most dramatic resolution, I'm satisfied that something came out of all this. As for the civil lawsuit regarding the damage to my house, that was a bit more complicated but also more satisfying in terms of the outcome. As you know, I initially offered my parents a solution to avoid the legal mess. Pay me $5,000 for the damages, and we'd all save ourselves a lot of hassle. They rejected that offer, probably thinking they could get out of the problem or that it wouldn't have many consequences. Well, it turned out that we ended up in a much more expensive negotiation for them. In the end, we settled on an agreement where my parents had to pay me $7,000. That amount covered the kitchen repairs and my lawyer's fees, but doesn't include their own legal costs, which surely cost them even more. It's a bit ironic when I think about it. If they had accepted the $5,000 I initially offered, they would have saved a lot of money and headaches, but they chose to push things further. In the end, they ended up paying more, and as often happens, they suffered the consequences of their stubbornness. Part of me feels a certain satisfaction in seeing that they had to face the reality of their actions, but another part of me is simply exhausted by the whole situation. Honestly, I would have preferred to reach an agreement much sooner, but some people need to learn the hard way. What I didn't expect was that all this would have such a direct impact on my dad's work life. Turns out that, because of this whole situation, my dad ended up losing his job. My mom, on the other hand, is still employed. And, as I mentioned before, all of this could have been avoided. If they had accepted the original offer, if they hadn't insisted they were right, things would have been different. Now my dad is without a job, and although I don't have all the details about their current financial situation, I'm sure it's not easy for them. However, I don't want this update to be all about problems and family conflicts. I want to share something positive and joyful, because not everything in my life revolves around lawsuits and issues with my parents. In fact, I have some incredibly exciting news. My brother and Ashley's baby was born 4 days ago. After all the stress and difficult moments, this news has been a ray of light for our family. My nephew was born healthy with no complications, and both he and Ashley are doing perfectly well. My brother is on cloud 9, and I couldn't be happier for them. And yes, my parents knew my brother was going to have a grandchild, but it didn't seem to matter to them. We haven't had any contact with them beyond court, and some family members have stopped inviting them to events after everything that happened, which is honestly a relief for all of us.